Hello and welcome everyone. This is our third time meeting for our LinkedIn live show because you matter, breaking down stereotypes with stories with Dr. Noémie Hermeking, and today we also have a special guest, Zanne Gaynor. So welcome, Zanne, welcome, Dr. Noémie.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thanks a lot. I would like to make a little introduction about the quote we have today. Would you mind to repeat the quote again, Furkan?
Of course, it's a lovely quote from Edward T.Hall. It's called Culture Hides More Than It Reveals. What does it mean actually, if you can expand it a little bit?
Exactly, and the quote actually continues a little bit, and it says, and strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. So why we chose that quote is actually because it raises awareness that we have to be aware of our own ethnocentrism, right? And what impact our cultural self has in order to understand other cultures. And I think that's also one of the outlook or endeavors you have, Zain, right? Correct? To understand other cultures?
Yes, that's really interesting, actually, the end of the quote, because in fact I started doing the sort of training that I do, which is working with native and non-native English speakers, looking at how they can make their language clearer. Because what I've discovered is that really native English speakers are not so aware of their language and their culture in a way that their colleagues or their peers might be, who've grown up learning a second, a third, or a fourth language. So I wanted to make those native English speakers really aware of what they could do to adapt their language and make their language more inclusive.
Okay, what would you say, thanks a lot, Zain, what would you say, Furkan, what is actually the goal of inclusive language? Why should we use it?
It's a very good point when it comes to English speakers and non-native English speakers. There's so much in it that we talked about the culture. How does it shape the language that we use as well? Started to learn English when I was in secondary school, and back in those days the resources were much limited than today, and it basically shaped how we started using some of the words comparing to others without getting to be more aware of what is the correct way of explaining ourselves, because even within our native language we prefer to choose some words comparing to the other ones, but we had no visibility in this learning a new language. So that is one of the biggest thing I have learned, especially coming to Ireland and starting to work in telecom industry. There are so many acronyms that I didn't even get familiarized myself in the first few months of the job. It was really difficult to express myself fully, and while I could express myself or become who I was easier. And what do you think, Dr. Noémie? Do you feel the same talking in German and in English?
I think it's very interesting, when you actually grow up with several languages. So I grew up bilingually French and German, and learned English afterwards. And specifically when you start to use a different language, I mean, right now we all use English, but for Furkan and for myself at least, English is not the first language. So I even find it, let's say, even harder to talk in an inclusive manner, because actually words carry meaning. And sometimes when you're not a first language speaker, you're not so much aware of all the meaning that is actually attached to words. And, and I was thinking, it can actually be so complicated, specifically, you're also from the tech company, Furkan, right? I thought about how many terms, are used in the tech company, for example, that are not gender neutral, for example, do you really have to talk about, let's say, manpower, right? Or, if you talk about computer programming, there's this term of the slave and the masters, right? So inclusive language, I think, also requires for us to avoid stereotypes, right? And use actually words that are, respect diversity, I would say, and that also favors a sense of belonging, because oftentimes it can just really exclude other people. What has been your experience, Zanne?
Well, that's really interesting. I think we're touching here on something that's critical, and that's that identity, isn't it? Language and identity are so intertwined. I have experience, I did a degree in French and German, and then I moved to Spain to study Spanish. And of course, what you realize is when you're speaking another language is that you're actually almost a different person at times. You just have a slightly different personality. You interpret things in different ways. And I think that sense of identity can be very easily affected by how other people behave and speak to you around you. I, for example, hear students sometimes talking about being native-splained to. So people who work in companies who speak English as a second language, they have very responsible jobs, they're very well qualified, but they'll find a native speaker will native-splain things. So maybe try and explain things over simply because they think the non-native speaker hasn't understood. And what that does is it actually affects their sense of professionalism and it knocks their confidence. So it's a very interesting area, this connection of identity and language.
Yeah. And I also think, it's, it has to do with identity, but I mean, there's so much more. I mean, basically, there's, there's the whole culture, or the whole, let's say, respect is attached to it. The way we talk with other people, time is attached to it. I mean, all these different, Geertz always talked about this web of meaning that makes us a person, actually embedded within the language we speak. I used to study actually Korean language, and it was amazing to see how even the way we talk with somebody in Korean actually shows all this respect and this honor that you have to show towards elders. Just a very big example, if you say hi to someone who is smaller than yourself, let's say, a small child, you would say annyeong. If I would say hi to or hello to a teacher who is you have to be more honorific, so it would be annyeong haseyo. And then if it's somebody even higher up, it would be annyeong hashimnika. So all this respect is actually, much longer, than the word itself. So it's really interesting because if you don't know how to address other people, you can also exclude other people, but it also shows all the meaning that are actually in words, right?
That's a very good point. It actually reminded me of when I was studying in a software engineering department at my university, because I was the only woman in the class. My lecturer used to call, "Let's could we focus in here? Let's have a look at here." And at first I find it like, oh my God, like I'm not being included in here, or am I like a visible person? I started to put my hands up and say, I'm here as well. It sometimes made an impact, sometimes it didn't, because my lecturer was going back into the same words. But again, it's just like how these choice of words make other people feel that they are part of that group or very much excluded. And going back to the breaking the stereotypes, with stories. Maybe I ask you, Zan, do you have a story that what is maybe one thing the listeners can do here to break that stereotype that maybe the challenges comes from language, maybe the coming from the cultural learnings? What could be maybe one thing that we can all do from today?
I think we have to start by acknowledging differences. And I think it's acknowledging differences, whether they're cultural or individual differences. We need to open up discussion in any sort of company or workplace where you've got multilingual or multicultural employees. By acknowledging that there are differences and getting people to discuss those differences, I think we can start to maybe deal with tensions that can arise in the workplace. I mean, I find that quite often when we talk about individual differences, I think the nice way of expressing is that we avoid those stereotypes, because you can find any group that will have individual differences, whatever the culture it is that they come from. So I think that's the key thing, really. Acknowledge it and create that space for discussion. And I think it's really appreciated by lots of colleagues, because some people won't feel, whether they speak English as a first or a second language, some people won't feel they can really be honest in their opinion. So you've got to create that space for them to do it.
Wonderful. And as you said, rebuilding that trust around it so that people can easily open up and be confident with their own differences is super important. And what about you, Naomi? Do you have an example too, or one key takeaway for the listeners?
I think I think what we should all do, in order for us to learn, is when in doubt, how to address somebody, we should actually ask them. Some of us, for example, have, started to put their pronouns on LinkedIn. So, people know if you, how you identify, right? But some might not identify, for example, with the gender binary, right? So, that is one way of showing how you actually identify. But if you don't know, I think it's always better to ask. And I think it's the same with people with disabilities. I mean, of course, I cannot talk about all people with disabilities, because I'm an inclusion officer for the company that I work for. So, I'm only in contact, let's say, with the colleagues that have a disability at my company. And of course, all of these people are very diverse, just like all the other people with disabilities all over the world. I mean, 1 in 5 people in the United States lives with a disability. But most importantly, we should, not forget that behind everybody is also an identity, just like you and me, So I cannot tell you, does this person prefer to be called a person with a disability or a disabled person? I mean, everybody is different. But certainly what I have realized, is specifically when working with people with disabilities, there are sometimes words that you can still hear. Let's say words like, blind-sided, or somebody is confined to a wheelchair, or phrases like that actually suggest that there are limitations to that person, or what kind of view do we have about the body, right? So I think we kind of have to watch and to reevaluate actually the words that we use, and we have to make a conscious effort the way we talk, and actually respect others as well, so they do not feel
Wonderful. And on the top of what we have talked, I would like to also add that showing your openness and approachability is one way to break the stereotypes. Like both of you mentioned, that we may not sometimes know that if we stereotyped, if we fall into the blind spots that we have, or if we offended somebody by a word that we have said maybe wasn't intentional, maybe the language barrier was there, whatever the reason. But if we put ourselves an open person and an approachable person and build that trust with another person, I believe this can be changed and this can be taken as a feedback, and we can learn from the experiences. To me, in communication, being open and showing that openness and trust is something so important, so that whatever the mistake we do, whatever the stereotype we fall into is can be done better next time. So that openness is something I would like to highlight for the listeners as well. And do you have anything else to add into this, Zanne?
Yes, I was just thinking about this making a conscious effort, and I think that's the thing with language. Quite often we use language instinctively. We don't think before we say things. So I think it's really important that we become more conscious and mindful of what we're doing. And I think even before you think about adjusting your language, I think you make those effective connections with people by really taking time to have those introductions, proper introductions. We often talk in our training about the usefulness of learning somebody's name. We've actually checked with each other this today, haven't we, how to spell names. But there's been some really interesting academic research done on the value of learning people's names. And they've done some tests with neurologists, and they've discovered that the brain actually lights up when somebody says your name correctly. And you're much more likely to interact with somebody if you can say their name properly. And also, if somebody says your name properly, you're much more likely to make that a connection with somebody. And quite often, particularly in multicultural groups, we tend to ignore those introductions, maybe because people don't know how to say people's names. They're a bit embarrassed about it. So we need to make those connections, firstly, by just introducing ourselves well to each other, and then thinking of the language that we're using.
Wonderful, Zanne. You actually reminded me of a time that one of my colleagues pronounced my name, started pronouncing my name so well. It just my attention straight away went there, and I felt so good with this one simple good pronunciation of my name. And I have done a poll on LinkedIn actually, and doesn't matter what commonality of the name or you hear it for the first time, they said over 75% of people said that their names are being constantly mispronounced, and how big impact it could have to building communication and building trust. And Naomi, do you have anything to add here? We can't hear you, Naomi. I don't know what happened.
I think we've maybe lost Naomi. I could just pick up on something there, Furkan, actually, because as well as names, it's also about getting to know that person as to what title they like to be called by as well. There may be a title that's important. Again, culturally, that could be something that varies from one culture to another, how you address somebody. And we just need to take that time to learn about the person that we're working with or speaking to. I think Naomi's back on.
No? Wonderful. We have Katrina who is looking to speak. Can you get to speak, Katrina? I have given you the permission. Welcome. You are on mute, Katrina. It's just the mute or unmute button on the bottom. If you can press that microphone on the bottom, you can, I think, unmute yourself. It looks like I don't have that option to unmute you on here. And while we are waiting for Katrina, I would like to remind for the 23rd of May. At the same time, we will at 12 noon for Irish time and 1 p.m. in Central European time. We are going to be talking about Maya Angelou's quote: if you are always trying to be normal, you will never know how amazing you can be, and how do we break that stereotype around this topic as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Katrina. Can you I don't know if you are able to unmute yourself. Please feel free to join. And Naomi, can you hear us, or if you can unmute yourself as well? We don't hear you, Naomi. And Zanne, again, thank you so much for joining today. We really enjoyed having you here, your inputs, your examples, your key takeaways. I'd like to thank everyone who joined listening to us here. Any questions you have that you didn't get an opportunity to share us today, feel free to contact us on LinkedIn. And this will be also shared on YouTube. We are going to share the link with you. And have a lovely day, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Furkan and Noémie.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.